Well, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the wonderful lecture. I'm here to talk to you about mental and physiological structure mechanisms of overprotection in the etiology of autoimmune disease. And before I start, I'll tell you a little bit about us. I'm representing actually an interdisciplinary research team, which comprise, we're doing a lot of research together on many different topics, and we're combining and integrating different professional fields, such as gynecology and medicine, psychotherapy, psychology, social work, etc. So I'm I'm a psychotherapist and a parental counselor, living here in Israel and teaching in a professional institute, which called ROTEM, for practical training for parental counselors and psychotherapists, together with Ofer Erez, who's a senior psychotherapist for children and adolescents, and together with Dr. Anna Kristolilov, who is actually a gynecologist working with adolescents and mothers, and actually studied psychotherapy as well, and integrating the field. So what we know is that despite the prevalence of the autoimmune diseases, which is growing almost daily and yearly, and the variety of those factors that involved in their etiology, we still don't know the exact cause of autoimmune disorders, and we're still looking for it. So as psychotherapists and a physician who are working with parents and children and seeing the processes of the psychological effects during years on their development, both psychologically and medically, we can see and theorize that the influence of overprotective parenting has upon the child's emotional development and development of his immune system and physical health, and actually how it can be harmed by a overprotective relationship. One word regarding the personal disclaimer here, connecting the professional with personal. I was diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis 5 years ago, and I'm specializing in working with anxiety disorders and parental counseling, and working a lot with overprotective parents. So it came together, of course. So we know that 150 years of psychological research and social work, we know that parenting behavior towards the child and the behavior and the relationship between the couple, the mother and the father, or any couple that raising the kid, has quite or more significant influence upon the child's mental and social well-being, his coping skills, and his actual adjustment to the real world when he's older. However, we did not know what we started to realize now is that overprotective parenting can seriously actually damage the health of our offspring. And that's really disturbing. So according to most professionals in our field, we agree that good enough or effective parenting is defined that parenting which prepares children and offsprings to meet the demands of specific culture or subculture in which they live. But are we preparing them or we not? That still remains a question, and the answers are really troublesome. So to define the concept of parental narcissistic anxiety is something that actually comes from the inevitable dependence of the child upon his parents, who provides the parents simultaneously with a lot of control and a lot of anxiety, with a lot of power over the baby when he's born. The need to control and protect the child is accompanied by a lot of anxiety for both the parent and the child, of course, transformed from. And those parents who cannot contain their own and their baby's narcissistic stage of development tend to develop a continuous stage of internal anxiety. So they actually keep on believing and perceive themselves as a savior during the years in which we already growing up, and we don't need that kind of saving as we needed as babies. So overprotective parenting style is actually defined by guardian behavior that is excessively to a child's developmental stage and the actual risk level in their environment. So it's over and it's too much, it's not needed, has nothing to do with the objective needs of the child or for protection, of course. So that's overprotective parenting style. So while we're protecting the child from danger and keeping him safe, we also gain a sense of control and even omnipotence. And that need and that sense is very valuable to a lot of parents, a lot of us. And the need to maintain this position of omnipotence and this perceiving ourselves as all known and all doing goes way beyond the child's objective needs for protection. So due to this actual unconscious need of the parent, he practices overprotective parenting and not actually protecting the child, but actually potentially puts him at risk, both psychologically, and in a minute we'll see how it's done also on a physical level. So that's a very tragic loop, because actually we know when researchers such as Davis in 2017 and others actually found that parents, children whose parents protect them from any kind of challenges faced even in education or in social life, they're over involved, they're overprotective, are actually risking to develop anxiety within the child and make him more stressful than he could be. And that overprotective behavior prevents children from learning and developing and implementing practical coping mechanisms. So this is, in our sense, is analogous to the immune system, which is relatively immature when child is born and has to evolve during a life of exposure to challenges, to multiple foreign germs and challenges, and then keep on going, being exposed and actually train the immune system during the adulthood. We know that researchers in Yale Medical School saw that some parental behavior have unintended, of course, consequences, since this need is unconscious. Of course, we're doing it unintentionally, but we have to start looking really deeply into ourselves and see what we're doing on a long run in future. So overprotective parents are more likely to raise children who develop allergies or autoimmune diseases later in life. And we were actually very, very interested in why does it happen? How can it go through the psychological barrier and actually affect our immune system and our health? So autoimmune diseases are clinical manifestations of dysfunctional and hyperactive autoimmune responses to self-antigens, and leading to inflammation, self-injury, or functional disturbance. So we know what we're talking about here. So a lot of researchers looked at what is actually what is actually developing a child's emotional regulation states, and they found that caregiving relationship comprises the fundamental context to developing any emotional regulation in children. So it's actually been all affected by parental relationship and the way they react to their kids. And children develop regulatory methods that can be either engaged or avoidant. So when we talked about overprotective parenting, we mostly see the development of avoidant regulation methods, which actually not provide the child with the possibility to develop coping skills that he really needs for life, either both mentally and for his immune system. So researchers, as Rees and his colleagues, saw that a parent's elevated sense of responsibility for the consequences of their child's actions leads to greater intrusiveness in the parent's interaction with their child. Highly anxious parents might experience exaggerated levels of responsibility, which promote anxiogenic parental behaviors, and then, of course, teaching and modeling those behaviors for their children. We can see that Leibovich and colleagues actually looked into anxiety disorders that are prevalent through lifetime and frequently begin in childhood and cause all, as we know, severe mental distress. And they described the behavioral system that contributes to the development of the anxiety in children. So they talked about vicarious learning, social references, modeling of parental anxiety, overcritical or overprotective parenting styles, and aspects of parental reactions to child's anxiety. He also spoke about biological systems that might impact the development of anxiety. And he talked about features of prenatal environment influenced by maternal anxiety, development and function of the oxytocin system, and genetic and also epigenetic transmission. So we see that anxiety is very, very involved here on all levels, both prenatal and even on the gene and epigenetic system. Fulton and colleagues actually defined the experiential avoidance, which is actually an avoidant strategy of a person that is transmitted from parents to children through behavioral learning. So it's actually internal model of coping, but it's actually transmitted as a behavioral modeling transmitted the same way. And we saw that parental behavior that especially the controlling ones and overprotection is actually perceived as over controlling. So it's actually a child is who experienced the parent very intrusive, very overprotective, very not allowing him to grow up and be accomplished with his coping skills, and actually provides him with a lot of anxiety, both the development of it and the preservation of those. Hayes and colleagues also saw that exercise and avoidance of unwanted internal experiences might initially result in distress reduction. So we actually avoid something that is stressful for us, or we don't have to deal with that stress, and thereby negatively reinforcing these avoidance behaviors. However, when we're doing it chronically, and the chronic avoidance has paradoxical outcomes, resulting in increased anxiety and, of course, dysfunction, because we don't actually exercise and develop those coping skills which allows us to actually deal with the real challenges in life later on. So it might help on a pill for a headache, but actually not doing any good for our further well-being and development. So if we look at Rook's old friend theory regarding the immune system, that suggests that frequent exposure to harmless microbes that have co-evolved with humans help to train actually developing the immune system. So it has to go with exposing the child for frustration. This is really there in life. We don't have to do much. We just don't need to actually prevent it from the child, of course, according to his skills and developmental stage, but overprotective parenting are doing over way too much. So we also can see that when people isolated from one another and spend their time mostly indoors, they might reduce their exposure to richer microbiomes from other sources, thereby limiting the development of the immune system. And we look at the COVID situation, when we were all closed up, and we actually saw the development of more viruses afterwards because people weren't exposed well enough for a long period of time in order to get the antibodies and to immune themselves. So if we look at the course of the development, which we theorize about, is that parental anxiety causes parental overprotection behavior, which in turn causes child's anxiety. Child is in stress, physiological stress. Child develops physiological overprotection over the stress, and later on develop autoimmune disease, and we will see how. So the medical part is actually, of course, was done together with me and Dr. Anna, Crystal, and Ofer. I'll explain the really, in really point form, if you want to know more regarding the medical part, we are going to publish the article which explains it all in a few weeks from now. So it will be provided with a lot more of medical details than we have here. But I'll just to comprise the thought we have so far. The immune diseases. The immune diseases are clinical manifestation of dysfunctional or hyperactive immune responses. So the fact that we're immune is not actually protecting us, but rather working against us in form of inflammation, self-injury, or a functional disturbance, as we know. So actually, we know that historically, autoimmune diseases were divided and differed historically by characterized by organ-specific inflammation causing tissue damage, either by autoinflammatory disorders or autoimmune disorders. So autoinflammatory disorders were the systemic or organ-specific inflammation that occurs in the absence of high titer antibodies and autoreactive lymphocytes, and autoimmune disorders were characterized by presence of pathophysiological involvement of antibodies and a self-reactive lymphocyte population. However, that kind of a division was a bit problematic because we can see that some disorders start with a mixed immunological pattern that drives inflammation. On the other hand, we can see changes in immunological factors that occur over the course of disease, and tissue damage that causes the exposure of intracellular nuclear components to immune cells, and their activation causes the antibody production and self-directed lymphocyte response. Therefore, today, since also that division was problematic, and because we see the dynamic process of the molecular laboratory findings that vary and change over time, also the combined with variable of clinical presentation of the same disease, different symptoms for the same disease or different treatment responses. So two people can have rheumatoid arthritis and respond differently to different treatments, and also present different and variable symptoms. We can now actually put the autoinflammatory diseases on an inflammatory spectrum, which has on one end of it the classic autoimmune conditions, and on the other side of the spectrum, the monogenic autoinflammatory conditions. So we know rheumatoid arthritis, multiple sclerosis, asthma, psoriasis, and all other autoimmune diseases that are growing and varying as we speak. We took rheumatoid arthritis not just because I was diagnosed by it, but as an example for how we consider it working, and combined with the, of course, overprotective parenting styles in that person's childhood. And in rheumatoid arthritis, what's happening is that antibodies exist in the condition, but might not be the initiating cause, rather than the phenomena of RA, actually a symptom and not the cause or a trigger of it. Rheumatoid arthritis is thought to be an immune-mediated disease, but its etiology still remains unknown, as a lot of other autoimmune diseases. The cytokines, we have the TNF and the interleukin-1, which are involved in the destruction of the tissue of the joint, that we know. However, what we don't know, and actually interesting to find out, is what causes the excessive production of cytokines or their entry into the joints. Also, either or, we still don't know what's happening, that this, cytokines are all of a sudden begin to lose their way and cause a lot of trouble. So we know that the etiology of autoimmune diseases so far is actually influenced by factors, hormonal factors, environmental factors, immunological factors, and genetic factors. However, in at least 50% of cases, the initiating factors are still unknown, and still, a lot of research are trying to find that out. If we look at stress in order to combine the child that grows up in a stressful environment, in order to see how stress and autoimmune disease work together, so we can see the vicious cycle of stress and physical illness in general, and in autoimmune diseases specifically. We can see that stress-inducing events have impact on the immune function. We know that. Physiological and stress, and physical and physiological stress play a role in the development of autoimmune disease. We know that too. Many patients with autoimmune disease reported unusual emotional stress right before the outbreak. And stress also can cause the disease exacerbation and worsening of symptoms in any kind of period. And the disease itself can cause a lot of significant stress in patients. And of course, that goes in vicious cycle, never ending. So if we look at the relationship between psychiatric disorders and autoimmune diseases, we see that Al-Sheikh's 2021 review demonstrated a significant increase in inflammatory and rheumatic biomarkers in patients with OCD. So OCD is very closely connected with a lot of autoimmunity, and lately it's been researched more and more. And next week, I'm going to be presenting another theory in the addiction conference regarding OCD and addiction that is actually related to that as well. The most significant inflammatory markers, biomarkers with were TNF and interleukins, which are has a lot to do with rheumatoid arthritis. So we know that stressful and OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, known as continuous and chronic stress and anxiety in a person. So we can see the relation with the inflammatory diseases as well. The possible role of psychological stress and the other major stress-related hormones as etiological factor in pathogenesis of autoimmune disease, a lot discussed in recent review, also by Herman and colleagues, Wolf, and others. So it's not just us, and it's really interesting, and a lot of research has to be done. So if we examine immune data in patients who had experienced earthquake disaster, we can see in one colleague's research in 2019, we saw that patients who suffer from PTSD, which is an anxiety disorder, one of the major anxiety disorders following any trauma. So those who had PTSD had higher levels of inflammatory cytokine scores compared to those controls that who were actually in the earthquake but did not suffer from PTSD. They did not, for some reason, develop anxiety or did not develop chronic anxiety as PTSD has. And they clearly saw the connection between the inflammatory activity and anxiety there as well. Carter and colleagues also demonstrated correlation between the presence of thyroid autoimmunity and mood anxiety disorders. So if we look at the physiological interaction between stress and physical illness, from where we are looking at it, we can see the neuroendocrine immune network, in which cells and products of the nervous system, endocrine glands, and immune system actually interact together and influence one another. So if we look at the interaction in this NEI network, so it's actually mediated by stress hormones such as epinephrine, norepinephrine, and others that actually lead to immune dysregulation or alter and amplify cytokine production, resulting in autoimmune disease, or reduce resistance to infection or disease, which is also has to do with the immune system. And mediators of which are glucagon, insulin, and growth factors, and numerous other mediators that are involved in those processes as well. So we can see that the experience of trauma or infection cause dysregulation of the balance of secretins and then to stress response and vice versa. If we look at the role of epigenetics in autoimmune and inflammatory disorders, and epigenetics, in my view, which actually comes from psychological perspective, epigenetic is the environment of the gene. And for me, the environment of the gene are the parents, who are the environment and psychological environment of the child. So epigenetic modification influence gene expression and alter cellular function without modifying the genome sequence. So actually what happens in the environment that causes the troubles here. We can see Suras and Hedrich research that actually was investigating the autoimmune inflammatory disease that not thought to be caused by gene mutation, rather than a combination of genetic susceptibility, the vulnerability, and the epigenetic modification arising from exposure to personal and environmental influence that define individual disease expression or symptomatology and outcome. So we know that two people actually can have the same, genetically genome, but will express differently by symptoms of the disease or their the reaction to the treatment. So it's supported by the fact that genetically identical twins even can differ regarding the frequency of the development and symptomatology of autoimmune or inflammatory disorders. So that's actually supporting our thought regarding that the environment, what's happening in the child's, where he grows, both in gene-wise and after birth, of course, and then it's actually more influential than any other thing. So it's our hypothesis that chronic anxiety caused by overprotective parenting might comprise an epigenetic effect on the development of the autoimmune disease through the neuroendocrine immune system. It's in our intention to conduct clinical research investigating the experience of parenting of people suffering from autoimmune autoinflammatory conditions. We're actually at this point in which we are qualitatively interviewing people with who are now grown-ups who have autoimmune diseases of different kinds regarding their experience as children growing up in their families. And we already can see that most of the people who answered so far and we were talking to, actually everybody not experienced their childhood with as overprotected, not providing the person with the belief that he can overcome challenges and therefore, of course, develop the coping skills he needs for life, both on psychological and physiological levels. Thank you very much for listening, and hopefully that will get some use to think about it on that level as well. And I will be happy to answer any questions if I could. Hold on, I'll try to not share, stop sharing. Yeah.
Thank you, Anat Ben Salman, for this wonderful talk. Anyone having any queries to ask Anat Ben Salman can please unmute and proceed now.
I have questions on the chat.
Yeah, I can see them. Do you want me to read them or do you want to read them?
No, you go ahead, read them and answer them.
Okay, so thank you for writing the questions. I'll try to answer what I can, and what I cannot, I'll transfer to my partners, and we'll be happy to email you with the questions, because those are wonderful thoughts. So there's a question. The first question is overprotection better than underprotection? Actually, from psychological level, they're both are really harmful. I can tell you, maybe I can explain it simply. In both cases, when the child is either overprotected or underprotected, is caused by a parent who is in huge anxiety and distress on his own. And actually what he decides to do with the child, it has nothing to do with the child. So actually both of those kids will experience as unnoticed in some way, because it has nothing to do with them. Because if the child feels that he has the ability to overcome that challenge or another, and the parent comes and say, oh, no, you can't, it has nothing to do with the child. It has to do with parental anxiety. So in this case, he'll be overprotective. Underprotection will be unnoticing the child and neglecting him in practically in the same way. So we now know that either is not good. And good enough parent is the parent who actually provides the child according to his developmental stage to overcome the challenges and deal with frustration in order to develop that muscle of coping within him. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, okay? Thanks.
Is that okay? Okay. I'll go to the second question. So do you consider lockdowns by government, not parents, during the pandemic's overprotection? It seems that many in the US have thought that the lockdowns has done harm to children and teenagers. Well, first of all, we do know that a lot of harm was actually caused by the lockdown. I don't know if we had any choice or not. I'm not going to even try to go into political, consideration of it, whether it was needed or not, because I think that COVID is something still a lot of unknown. I think the government tried to do what they thought would be helpful. Of course, it made harm on a psychological level, on the relationship level, on a lot of mental disorders. We are expecting here in Israel, when the first lockdown was already in process, we are already been reported that we expect around 1 million people who will suffer from anxiety disorders a year after COVID is over. We now know it's a lot more, so we know the levels of frustration, the levels of anxiety, the levels of violence grew when we were in lockdown because of many of the reasons, because we were not prepared for it, and we don't know how to deal with, enforced change, even if the change is to lock down all of us inside. I can tell you other things regarding COVID and overprotection. Regarding the omnipotence, the parent, was provided. The COVID, actually the lockdown made an illusion for all the parents that while we are in lockdown, we are protecting our children and ourselves from dying. Okay, it was really, really, huge. So while we're locked down with our children, we're actually protecting them from it's a life or death situation. When the lockdown was open and we were like allowed to go out and go back to schools, a lot of parents lost that experience of omnipotence that was provided for them unconsciously, right? They only felt that when they start to be anxious for the children to go out, although it was allowed. Okay, so that kind of can give you some impression of what I was talking about. The need to feel that I'm protecting my child from everything is, very, very basic need. And when it's too much, it causes, of course, damage because it has nothing to do with the child. I hope that gives you some perspective from mine.
We can go to the next question.
Okay, so what are the quantitative ways of considering overprotection? I think that we can see when I always tell parents that I work with is see if the child is actually capable of doing something on his own. When the child is capable physically or mentally to overcome something like get dressed, a baby of 3 months cannot get dressed by himself. A boy of 3 years old and farther can get dressed. Don't dress him if he can get dressed by himself. So everything we do that child can potentially do on himself will be considered overprotection. So the way we can see the effects of it will be a lot of anxiety, loss of self-confidence, very frightened children, very children who feel that they cannot do much and they need the parent all the time and they don't believe in themselves. So hopefully those are quantitative weights to consider, but a lot of other symptoms of behavior level. And the last question is overprotection going to consider as child abuse? Child abuse has a very specific definition, and the way we define it here in Israel, abuse is everything that is not providing the child's basic need to grow up as a independent person when he's older, and provided all the as actually harming him. So in my view, it's not less than abuse, because if we're abusing the child by not providing him the coping skill he needs for life, not only that we're harming him on the psychological levels, we now also can see a lot of damage on a physiological levels, and that's very harsh. So thank you for those questions.
Thank you, Annette Ben-Salmon, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you.
And now we will have 15 minutes of break, refreshment break, and we'll be back soon to hear from other speakers.